Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be finally talking about the newest album, the sophomore album from Elle King, Shake the Spirit. So I'm going to say something that's a little bit strange here. I'm not sure Elle King was done any favors by X and O's becoming a hit in 2015. Now on the surface, that might sound crazy. Most acts in rock, especially those who can straddle the scuzzy lane between blues, alternative country, and the indie scene, they would kill for any sort of crossover success this decade, especially when it cracks the top 10 on the Billboard Hot 100. But that's part of my point. For a moment in 2015, Elle King seized the popular attention with a blend of retro sounds that almost screamed novelty to the mainstream, while simultaneously plainly showing her influences, which many critics ascribe to squatting firmly between Amy Winehouse and any slew of modern indie blues rockers with a fuzzy guitar pickup and a fat groove in the bass and kick drum, especially the Black Keys. But while I might be mostly fond of that blend of sound, it just wasn't all that unique if you go into the indie scene, especially if you look towards country. And going back to her debut album Love Stuff that year, I just wasn't as wowed as I wanted to be. Yeah, there were a couple great songs. America's Sweetheart was a pretty great barn burner with that banjo, and I liked Elle King's vocal texture and charisma, but as a whole the album felt too polished and direct, and the blown out groove sections could get really tiresome, and it could have likely done well more positioned towards the radio than the critics, in an era where there was a space on the airwaves for more than just one song coming from Elle King, or indeed anything coming from those genres. And given that we hadn't really heard anything from Elle King since, I'll admit I was surprised on patrons threw a lot of support behind her sophomore follow-up, Shake the Spirit, this year, which reportedly was trying for a broader cross-section of sounds, which to me smacked of trying to maintain her identity while trying to capture some of that retro magic again, which could be risky for maintaining the album cohesion, but hey, I wouldn't say no to another America's Sweetheart, and hopefully one of those styles that I still do like would manage to help her strike gold. So what do we get out of Shake the Spirit? So I gotta be very honest here, even coming in with some lower expectations, I was still not all that impressed whatsoever with Shake the Spirit. And what's exasperating is that at this point, I'm not sure whatsoever whether it's an issue with Elle King's songwriting just not being there in a way that it truly cuts for me, or that her producers just had no idea what direction to properly expand her sound. Likely a combination of both, especially given the producers from her debut, most of them are not showing up here. What's more, it's not like Elle King is without a template in this lane or didn't have peers she could emulate, because when you have a year with better projects coming in from Lindy Ortega, Nico Case, the Pistol Annies, and Courtney Marie Andrews, among others, it's just a little bit hard for me to be impressed by a surface texture of Elle King when there's just not all that much beneath it, especially when you make the comparison to Love Stuff. The songs just aren't here in the same way, and sadly, it means the album's not really good. And this starts from the assertion that, again, I really like Elle King as a performer, at least in terms of her unique vocal timbre, and I do think she's at least trying to add some more subtlety and soul this time around to her delivery, and while it does sound absolutely murderous on her throat, that gritty raspiness in her attempts to infuse it with more emotive pathos, that's a tricky task that she mostly sticks to landing. If there's a reason to listen to this album at all, it is her voice. And yet around that voice is where the problems with this album unfortunately start, namely surrounding the backing vocals and the placement of that voice within the mix. Now in the former case, the album goes in one of two directions. You get your female girl group and soul harmonies inspired by the 60s, which can feel a shade bit jarring against her gritty timbre, but that can still work if layered properly. And then what sounds like an attempt at old Hollywood musical doo-wop or crooner vocals from guys, which absolutely don't fit with anything, especially given how clean they are, and they feel distracting whenever they come into the mix, starting early on Talk of the Town and reaching their most incoherent and yet incredibly grating on It Girl. But you know what? All this would assume that Elle King's vocals are front and center within the mix, and they're the highlight, which oddly doesn't happen nearly as often as it should. And to discuss this, we really need to talk at length about the production. Now for starters, as much as this album wants to embrace those blown out garage rock and blues timbres with the noisy flattened snares, the scuzzy lead guitar line, and the fat bass lines and kick drums, about the last thing Elle King should want is to bury her voice behind lo-fi vocal pickups where she will start then peaking in the mix. And yet on otherwise decent songs like Shame and Told You So, she's stuck behind filters that feel increasingly ham-fisted and irrelevant to add any sort of edge. Or thanks to Greg Kurstin on production on a song like Baby Outlaw, which is still probably one of the best songs here, she's stuck amidst a thicker well of reverb that she doesn't need. And none of this meshes at all with any of the backing vocals, which leads to an approach that could have been more homegrown and organic, but it now feels kind of assembled in post, and that's about the worst thing possible. But really, if I want to go on the production as a whole, it would be an utter lack of subtlety in the mixing. And let me start by saying that's not inherently bad. If this album was overstuffed with huge hooks like X's and O's and America's Sweetheart, that would be one thing. But on an album where Elle King is trying to split the difference and have some more subtle, emotive, quieter moments, she's stuck with producers who cram the mix with extraneous horns or arranged elements or effects that just don't add enough to justify their existence. And sure, part of this added theatricality you could expect from making a slight pivot away from alternative country to more soul and retro pop, but given how it runs at cross purposes to her lyrical approach, it can feel really overstated and garish and not conducive to cultivating any sort of tangible atmosphere. Take a song like Shane, where it's trying to sound more dark and edgy, but it's not willing to give things more space or build any sense of smoky edge. Or go to Good Thing Gone, where she probably didn't need the lo-fi elements around her vocal pickup on a breakup song with that kind of horns and organ. I mean, I like the soul vibe, but focus on your strengths. And then you get the double header of It Girl and Ram Jam, both of which bring some really cluttered grooves, no coherent melody, blocky horn progressions, and no coherent sense of momentum. They're just really messy songs. And that's not saying that Elle King can't stick the landing occasionally. The piano soul duet of Chained with Cameron Neal actually shows some great chemistry, but then the horns are dropped in and they don't serve any real purpose or add to the vibe. And it doesn't help matters when the sequencing of this album, it feels so shuddering and lopsided, with slow burn ballads dominating the back half of this album in blocks, and then running considerably longer than anything else on here, especially when the melodies aren't especially unique or work to differentiate themselves from those influences. And honestly, as much as I wanted to get into the garage rock solos, they aren't that interesting either. And on that topic, might as well get to the lyrics. Because look, I wouldn't have minded the back half of this album being so ballad heavy if the writing had taken a step up to match, but sadly, Elle King's writing can feel just as clunky as her production. And no, even if we didn't have artists like Lindy Ortega and the Pistol Annies and Nico Case playing in a similar lane with way more subtlety and maturity, this would still be an issue here. Now, for one, if this album was willing to go over the top and truly embrace that campy theatricality, it doesn't quite have the flair for detail beyond some bad girl cliches and posturing to really stick with me. I mean, Baby Outlaw gets the closest, but I will say it's a little bit rich for her to castigate a line on Man's Man for doing cocaine lines and then calling her when he's in trouble when she's out there cheating anyway. And yes, the framing is never placing her as a victim in any of these cases or even much of a good guy. A Man's Man certainly treads into some awkward territory when taking shots at this guy, telling him to go and be some other man's man. That's not clever wordplay. That's a sort of revealing and uncomfortable subtext surrounding what Elle King thinks is okay to denigrate. And then it happens again on Runaway, with it being revealed on the second verse that the guy she was with was also another guy's, and that's why they split up. Which to me doesn't reflect hatred and more just a lack of thought surrounding the implications going into her writing. It's the same way as much as Talk of the Town tries to denigrate those girls gossiping about the hot new guy by using gossip herself. Or how Naturally Pretty Girls can't help but let his jealous streak really cut through. Or how Runaway plays into its own self-aware melodrama so heavily it's hard for me to take it seriously, especially given how sincere it's trying to be. And then there's It Girl, a song that feels so incoherent in its view towards men, sex, and girls who want sex themselves that somehow winds up feeling sex negative, really insecure, and really demeaning and unflattering towards everyone involved, guys and girls. I mean, the one song I think hits any sort of nuance is Chained, which flips the script on a toxic relationship as she realizes despite all their problems, love will hold them together, and that's kind of a good thing, they guess. But it's reflective of a consistent lack of realism and maturity across this album that, I'll admit, really bugs me. And really, that gets close to my issues with this album as a whole. It's an album that wants to be self-aware, but oversells its self-flagellation without digging deeper into questions as of why, or any consideration of the larger scene, or adding details to even paint that larger scene. A fair amount of instrumental stylism to paint the scene, sure, but dig a little bit deeper, it feels thin and inorganic, and the slapdash production approach doesn't help, especially when you have so many different comparison points. And that's a shame, because when this album slows down to those half-spoken word interludes that are trying to be more revealing and honest, we see traces of what coalesced to mean a little bit more, a revealing bluntness that I wish felt more supported by her sound or more lyrical detail. And again, I think if she had blown up more naturally through the indie scene, this sort of development would have been naturally cultivated well, and her voice could age more gracefully into this period. But as it is, it's kind of a mess, and weirdly a lot less compelling and memorable than it should be, especially coming off the highlights of her debut, because this is a sophomore slump. So I don't know. For me, it's a very strong 5 out of 10. I guess a recommendation for the fans. You probably already heard it if you are, but for me, it was a disappointment, and I can't see myself throwing much more support behind Elle King, at least until she grows up a bit. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I'm being harsh here, guys, but again, when you swap out the entire production team for an entire new set of folks, and it doesn't click, and the writing, which is trying to be more serious, that also doesn't click, it just doesn't give me a lot to really say, especially when it doesn't flatter her all that well. But hey, if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below, and I got the poll up there if you all want to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting my channel, or potentially voting on my schedule so that this could have been covered, let's say, a month ago, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. Fair warning, the whole Patreon process might be changing within less than a week or so just keep your eyes out over there if you don't want to hop in right away. Just keeping a note. Oh, if you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below, @SpectrumPulse. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.